October 8, 1978. O'Hare International Airport, Chicago. A commercial airliner rolls to a stop at the gate. Among the passengers disembarking into the fluorescent corridors of the terminal is a man who does not exist. He's 31 years old. He carries a Canadian passport in the name of William Dyson. He looks tired. He looks unremarkable. He walks to the United States Customs counter, hands over his travel documents, and answers the standard questions about his itinerary with the calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment several hundred times in a facility outside Moscow that is not listed on any open-source map. The customs officer stamps the passport. The man collects his documents. He walks through the gate and steps out into the crisp autumn air of the American Midwest. He is in, but William Dyson does not exist. The name is a logistical bridge, a disposable identity constructed by a directorate within the KGB whose operational budget, personnel strength, and physical facilities remained entirely unknown to Western intelligence for the better part of 4 decades. Underneath the fabricated Canadian persona is a man born in East Germany in 1947, trained in Moscow for 7 years, and deployed to the United States as an illegal intelligence operative with a single, long-term operational objective: to disappear. To understand the institutional machinery that put this man on that aircraft and walked him through that checkpoint, it is necessary to understand Directorate S. Within the already heavily classified First Chief Directorate of the Committee for State Security, the KGB, Directorate S occupied a position of exceptional operational sensitivity. It was the directorate responsible for the illegals program. Not the conventional intelligence officers who worked out of Soviet embassies under diplomatic cover. Not the agents recruited from local populations in target countries. The illegals, the operatives who possessed no diplomatic passports, maintained no official connection to the Soviet government, and operated in target countries under completely fabricated civilian identities with no safety net of any kind. If they were arrested, Moscow would deny them. If they were prosecuted, Moscow would not negotiate their release. If they died in the performance of their mission, their existence would be officially classified until the archival release program of a post-Soviet Russian government that none of them, in 1978, had any reason to believe would ever exist. The illegals program was operationally distinct from every other category of Soviet intelligence activity in one fundamental and philosophically significant respect. Its assets were not inserted into the enemy's institutions. They were inserted into the enemy's society. The objective was not to place a KGB officer inside the CIA or inside the State Department or inside a defense contractor with classified facilities access. The objective was to place a Soviet intelligence operative so deeply inside the civilian fabric of American life that he became, for all practical, institutional, and social purposes, indistinguishable from an American. The cover was not a story, it was a life. A functioning, tax-paying, grocery-buying, television-watching, beer-drinking American life maintained continuously, without interruption, without a support network, and without the psychological relief of being able to tell anyone, ever, who you actually were. The man who walked through O'Hare Customs on October 8, 1978, had been selected for this mission 7 years earlier, in 1971, when he was 24 years old and serving as a mid-ranking officer in the East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi. His name was Albrecht Dittrich. He had been identified by a Directorate S talent recruitment program as a candidate with a specific combination of characteristics that the program's psychological assessment methodology rated as exceptionally suitable for long-term illegal deployment. He spoke English with near-native fluency. He had no family connections that would make his prolonged absence from East Germany operationally complicated to manage. His psychological profile indicated high tolerance for social isolation, strong operational discipline under unmonitored conditions, and what the assessment report described as an adaptive social intelligence, an instinctive ability to read social environments and calibrate personal presentation to match expected norms. He was, in the coldest possible analytical language, built for this. The training program to which Dittrich was assigned in 1971 was conducted at a facility outside Moscow that the KGB's internal administrative records designated simply as the E School. Its location, its curriculum, and the identities of its instructors remained classified until the partial archival releases of the 1990s. What the declassified material reveals is that the program ran for a minimum of 5 years for illegals candidates destined for deep cover deployment in the United States, in that its curriculum covered, in exhaustive and methodical detail, every aspect of American civilian life that a Soviet operative might be required to convincingly inhabit. The English language instruction ran to 11 hours per day, 7 days per week, for the first 2 years, targeting not merely grammatical fluency, but the accent, rhythm, idiom, and register of working-class American speech. Instructors included, according to the partially declassified records, several individuals who had themselves lived in the United States for extended periods under various covers, and whose operational knowledge of American social texture was therefore direct rather than derived from secondary analysis. The non-linguistic components of the curriculum were equally comprehensive. American consumer culture, in its 1970s specifics, was studied with the analytical rigor of an academic discipline. Trainees learned to navigate the American banking system, the Social Security Administration, the federal tax infrastructure, the rental housing market, the healthcare bureaucracy, and the employment landscape, not from textbooks, but from actual American administrative documents, actual American consumer product packaging, actual American utility bills and lease agreements and employer tax forms. The objective was that when the deployed operative encountered any of these systems in the field, his interaction with them would generate no anomaly, no hesitation, no unfamiliarity, no micro-signal of institutional dissonance that a vigilant counterintelligence officer might register as worth investigating further. The investment that the Soviet state made in each individual illegal was, by any institutional metric, extraordinary. The training alone represented years of state resource allocation. The fabricated identity documentation required separate operational effort of considerable complexity, and the ongoing logistical support infrastructure required to maintain an illegal in the field represented a permanent, open-ended operational commitment that only Directorate S, with its dedicated budget and its exclusive institutional mandate, could sustain. The identity that Directorate S had constructed for Albrecht Dittrich was built on a foundation that is perhaps the most morally striking aspect of the entire Soviet illegals program, and simultaneously one of its most operationally brilliant. The foundational document of Dittrich's American legend was a birth certificate. Not a fabricated document, a real one, belonging to a real person. A child who had died in 1955, aged 11, in Maryland. His name was Jack Barsky. In the mid-20th century, vital records management in the United States was a matter of local government administration. Birth records were maintained by county registrars. Death records were maintained by separate county departments. The cross-referencing of these two record sets, the matching of a death record to the corresponding birth record, to flag a deceased individual's identity as no longer available for use, was not systematically performed. The systems simply did not communicate with each other in any automated or routine way. A child who was born and died in the same county might have a death record sitting in the same building as his birth record, in adjacent filing cabinets, without any administrative mechanism connecting them. Directorate S had identified this administrative vulnerability in the late 1950s, during the early development of the illegals program's American deployment capability. Soviet embassy personnel, officers operating under diplomatic cover, whose secondary operational function included systematic intelligence collection about American administrative infrastructure, had been tasked with identifying the specific procedural gaps in the American vital record system that could be exploited to construct viable long-term identities for illegal operatives. The cemetery survey technique was one of the products of that research. Embassy officers, or their recruited local assets, physically visited municipal cemeteries, and noted the names and dates of children who had died young decades prior, whose birth records would still be accessible through the standard county registrar application process. Jack Barsky's grave in a Maryland cemetery had been identified through exactly this process. An unspecified number of years before Albrecht Dittrich arrived at O'Hare, a Soviet intelligence asset had obtained a certified copy of Jack Barsky's birth certificate from the Maryland Records Office through a standard administrative request. That piece of paper was Dittrich's entire American foundation. From Chicago, Dittrich traveled to New York. He rented a cheap transient room in a neighborhood where transient occupancy generated no administrative anomaly. Cash payments, no lease, no background check. From Chicago, Dittrich traveled to New York. He rented a cheap transient room in a neighborhood where transient occupancy generated no administrative anomaly. Cash payments, no lease, no background check. And then, with the Jack Barsky birth certificate as his only document, he walked into a Federal Social Security Administration office and applied for a Social Security card. The moment he entered that office was the operational crux of the entire deployment. Everything that followed, every subsequent cover document, every employment record, every bank account, every tax filing, every element of the American life he was about to construct, depended entirely on what happened at that counter. If the clerk was suspicious, if the application was flagged, if anyone in that office decided to pull the Maryland death records and cross-reference the birth certificate applicant against the mortality files, the operation would end before it had properly begun. The clerk asked the inevitable question. Why was a man in his 30s applying for a Social Security number for the first time? How had he managed to live and work for his entire adult life without one? Dittrich deployed his legend. He had been raised on a remote, off-the-grid farming property in rural New Jersey. He had dropped out of school early. He had worked entirely for cash throughout his adult life, entirely outside the formal economic system. He was applying now for the first time because he wanted to move to the city and get a legitimate, documented job. He answered calmly. He made no mistakes. His American English, 7 years in the making, produced no accent anomaly that the clerk registered as requiring further investigation. The application was processed. The card was issued. Albrecht Dittrich was gone. Jack Barsky was legally recognized by the United States government. With that single administrative transaction, a Soviet intelligence operative had successfully inserted himself into the American administrative system at ground level, with documents that would pass every routine verification check that the civilian infrastructure of the United States was capable of performing in 1978. He now had a name that the government acknowledged. What he needed next was a life that fit that name. Moscow Center's operational directive for Barsky's cover employment was specific and strategically considered. He was not to seek employment in government service, where background checks might eventually expose the thinness of his administrative history. He was not to seek employment in corporate environments that might draw the kind of professional profile scrutiny that would be inconsistent with his legend's biographical simplicity. He was to embed himself in the working-class civilian economy, the kind of employment that paid wages, generated tax records, and required no investigation of prior history beyond the most cursory. The objective was not career advancement. The objective was camouflage. Barsky's initial employment as a bicycle courier in Manhattan was operationally ideal. It was transient, cash-adjacent, and required no documentation beyond a bicycle and a willingness to work. More importantly, it served a direct intelligence function. Riding the grid of Manhattan for several hours per day gave Barsky a granular, physically embodied knowledge of the city's geography, the rhythm of its traffic, the layout of its commercial districts, the location of its transit infrastructure, the physical character of neighborhoods that might be relevant to future operational requirements, including dead drop placement and surveillance detection routing. He was not just earning money. He was mapping his operational environment from the inside. Over time, leveraging the mechanical aptitude that his East German technical education had given him, Barsky transitioned into the electrical trades. He obtained a New York electrical apprenticeship qualification. He began working as an electrician on commercial properties across Manhattan. He paid his taxes. He obtained a bank account. He acquired a credit history. The legend thickened with every passing month, accumulating the administrative sediment of a genuinely lived American working-class life. The communications architecture that connected Barsky to Moscow Center was, in its operational design, a masterwork of Cold War tradecraft engineering. It operated on 3 primary channels, each serving a different function and each calibrated to generate minimal detectable signal in the counterintelligence environment of the United States in the 1980s. The first channel was the numbers station. Every Thursday evening, at a precisely predetermined hour, Barsky would sit at a shortwave radio receiver, a commercially available unit, purchased in cash, that could be found in the apartment of any serious radio enthusiast, and tune to a specific frequency. The transmission he received came from a high-power broadcasting array located in Cuba, operated by the Soviet intelligence apparatus. What came through the static was a synthetic female voice reading 5-digit number groups in Spanish. To anyone who happened to scan across that frequency, it was inexplicable and uninteresting noise. To Barsky, working with a one-time pad, a booklet of truly random number sequences, each page used once and then chemically destroyed, it was operational instruction. The one-time pad is mathematically unbreakable when used correctly. If the pad is truly random and each page is used only once, the encrypted message cannot be decrypted by any analytical method without access to the corresponding pad. The NSA and the FBI's signals intelligence capabilities, however vast and sophisticated, were operationally irrelevant against a correctly used one-time pad. Barsky could receive operational instructions from Moscow Center in the middle of his own apartment, on a commercially available radio receiver, without generating any exploitable intelligence for the American counterintelligence apparatus. After each decryption, the used page of the pad was torn out and destroyed, the paper treated with a chemical that caused it to combust completely and immediately, leaving no residue. The message had been received. The channel had been used. The evidence of both had ceased to exist. The second communications channel was the microdot. For intelligence that Barsky needed to transmit back to Moscow Center, political profiling data, assessments of potential recruitment targets, operational status reports, the channel of choice was the physical mail system, routed through a proxy network that insulated both ends of the communication from direct detection. A full typed intelligence report would be photographed at extreme reduction using a concealed camera system, producing a film negative approximately 1 millimeter in diameter, the size of a typeset period at the end of a sentence. This microdot would then be carefully embedded beneath the postage stamp of an ordinary-looking postcard addressed to a legitimate-appearing civilian address in Austria or West Germany. The postcard, if intercepted and subjected to routine mail screening, was a postcard. The microdot, unless the intercepting party specifically knew to look for it and had the optical equipment to find it, was invisible. At the proxy address, a cutout would collect the mail and forward the intelligence through secure diplomatic channels to the First Chief Directorate in Moscow. The third channel was the dead drop, for the transmission of physical materials, emergency communications, and the periodic resupply of operational resources, including fresh, one-time pad pages and funding. Before executing a dead drop, Barsky was required by protocol to conduct a surveillance detection route of between 8 and 10 hours, a complex, pre-planned sequence of transit movements specifically designed to confirm that he was not under physical surveillance. Multiple subway lines, sudden car changes as the doors closed, passage through department stores with multiple exits, extended periods of movement through crowded pedestrian areas where a surveillance team would be required to maintain coverage with multiple personnel in close proximity, increasing the statistical probability that Barsky would identify at least one team member through repeated sighting. Only after completing a clean SDR would Barsky approach the dead drop location itself, a specific street fixture, a particular section of park bench, a designated utility box, make the necessary exchange, and withdraw. The entire operation might consume an entire day for a transaction that lasted 30 seconds at the physical location. That was, by design, exactly how it was supposed to work. The operational product that Jack Barsky transmitted to Moscow Center during the late 1970s and early 1980s was primarily what Directorate S classified as political profiling intelligence. He was not, in those early years, producing the kind of intelligence that appears in the popular mythology of Cold War espionage, stolen weapons specifications, classified government documents, signals, intelligence intercepts. He was producing something subtler, and in the KGB's operational doctrine, more foundational. Assessments of the political, social, and ideological texture of American civilian life. Moscow Center's strategic theory for the illegals program in this period was built on a specific intelligence doctrine. The assumption was that the most valuable long-term intelligence asset was not a single individual with access to classified documents, but a systematically developed understanding of where American society was vulnerable to ideological penetration, which political actors, which academics, which mid-level government officials, which corporate figures might be susceptible to eventual recruitment by other Soviet assets. Barsky's function, in this framework, was less that of a conventional intelligence, in collector and more that of an advanced reconnaissance element, mapping the ideological terrain for future exploitation by other components of the Soviet intelligence apparatus that would never be deployed at all if the terrain mapping produced no viable targets. In 1982, Barsky married an American woman. In 1983, they had a child together. He was not instructed to do this. Directorate S had not specifically mandated family formation as a cover requirement, but the operational logic of deep cover deployment created powerful practical incentives toward it. A single man in his mid-30s with no apparent family connections or social network was a marginal statistical anomaly in American civilian society, not suspicious enough to attract attention, but visible enough to be notable. A married man with a child, a mortgage, a regular job, and a neighborhood social circle was invisible. He was, socially speaking, the baseline of American civilian existence. Nobody looks twice at the electrician with the family in New Jersey. Nobody performs a counterintelligence assessment on the man who coaches Little League. The family was, in the coldest possible operational analysis, the most effective cover element in Barsky's entire legend. But a paradox was building inside the operational architecture that Directorate S had so carefully constructed. The doctrine that had produced Barsky's cover, the doctrine that said the most effective cover was a genuinely lived life, contained within it a logical impossibility that the theorists in Moscow had failed to fully account for. A genuinely lived life changes the person living it, not as performance, not as strategic adaptation, but in the fundamental psychological way that all lived experience changes human beings. The streets of Manhattan changed Barsky. The electrical work changed him. The marriage changed him. The child changed him, and not in ways that could be quarantined from his operational identity. The daily experience of the American working class was, for a man who had been raised in East Germany and trained in Moscow on a theoretical model of American society as a system of exploitation and imminent collapse, a continuous and increasingly irreconcilable confrontation with observable reality. The supermarket shelves were not empty. They were full. The working-class Americans Barsky worked alongside were not immiserated. They were, by the metrics of the comparative standard that Barsky carried in his memory from East Germany, doing remarkably well. They owned their apartments or were buying houses. They drove cars. Their children attended adequately funded schools. They experienced in their daily lives a degree of personal autonomy and consumer choice that bore essentially no resemblance to the theoretical model that Directorate S had trained Barsky to use as his analytical framework. He could not square what his training told him to see with what his eyes were actually showing him. And this cognitive fracture, growing slowly but continuously from the first year of his deployment onward, was beginning to produce observable effects in the quality and character of the intelligence product he was transmitting to Moscow's center. The analysts at the First Chief Directorate, who reviewed Barsky's operational reports, were not merely reading for content. They were reading for tone, for focus, for the subtle linguistic and analytical signals that indicated whether the operative producing the report was engaging with his tasking from the correct ideological framework. And what they began to see in the reports arriving from New York across the mid-1980s was a pattern of anomaly that grew more pronounced with each reporting cycle. The political profiling was losing its operational edge. When tasked with identifying specific individuals in American academic or governmental circles who might be susceptible to recruitment, Barsky's reports were increasingly returning assessments of unsuitable or low probability, without the supporting analytical rationale that standard protocol required. More troublingly, when the underlying reasoning could be partially reconstructed from the available report content, the reasoning appeared to reflect the perspective of someone who had internalized the social context of his targets rather than assessed them from the outside. He was not evaluating potential recruits as a cynical intelligence officer looking for exploitable vulnerabilities. He was evaluating them as a neighbor, a colleague, a fellow resident of the society they all inhabited together. He was demonstrating, in the most operationally significant sense possible, empathy. The First Chief Directorate's response to these anomalies was governed by a calculus that had nothing to do with Barsky's personal circumstances or the reasons for his apparent ideological drift. The calculus was purely operational. An illegal operative carries in his head a precise map of the communications architecture that connects him to Moscow's center. He knows the frequencies. He knows the proxy addresses in Europe. He knows the dead drop locations. He knows the encryption keys. He knows, in fragmentary but individually significant pieces, details about the operational infrastructure that supports not only his own mission, but potentially other missions being run by the same directorate through the same logistical channels. If he defects to the FBI, voluntarily or under coercion, the damage to Directorate S's operational capability is catastrophic and immediate. An operative going native is not a problem of ideology. It is a problem of information security. And by 1988, the First Chief Directorate had determined that the information security risk presented by Jack Barsky had crossed a threshold that required decisive operational response. The method chosen for communicating the recall order to Barsky was a visual signal, a prearranged emergency indicator that had been established during his operational briefing in Moscow 7 years earlier, a specific type of mark at a specific location on a specific route that Barsky traveled regularly. The signal's meaning had been memorized, not written down. It required no communication channel. It generated no electronic or paper record. And its message was, in the operational language that Barsky had been trained to read, entirely unambiguous. Your cover is burned. Hostile counterintelligence action is imminent. Abandon your current life immediately and proceed to emergency exfiltration protocol. Barsky saw the signal. He understood exactly what it meant. He understood the protocol that followed. The dry cleaning route, the emergency dead drop, the secondary identity documents, the land crossing into Canada, the proxy handler contact at a designated location in a Canadian city, the commercial transport back behind the Iron Curtain. He had rehearsed it all in Moscow. He knew every step, and he did not take a single one of them. He walked away from the signal. He went home. He looked at his wife. He looked at his child. And he made a decision that no one in Directorate S had believed an operative of his training and conditioning was capable of making. He chose the life he had been sent to perform over the state he had been sent to serve. What followed was a standoff of a kind that has no precise precedent in the documented history of Cold War intelligence operations. On one side, the First Chief Directorate of the KGB, the most heavily resourced and institutionally sophisticated intelligence organization on Earth, with a direct operational and security interest in recovering or neutralizing an operative who had refused a direct recall order. On the other side, a single man living in a house in New Jersey who had decided that the life he had built was worth more than the allegiance he had sworn. The mechanics of Barsky's defiance were, in operational terms, straightforward. He continued his daily routine. He went to work. He came home. He paid his bills. He did not retrieve the emergency dead drop. He did not execute the surveillance detection routes. He did not travel toward the Canadian border. And every Thursday evening, when the numbers station broadcast arrived over the shortwave receiver, the messages it contained were no longer routine operational directives. They were demands. Direct, unambiguous, escalating demands for his immediate compliance with the recall order. He decoded each one. He burned the one-time pad page. He did not respond. The phrase, extreme measures in KGB operational communications, had a specific, non-metaphorical meaning that any trained operative understood completely. Moscow Center was not making a bureaucratic notation. They were communicating the activation of a contingency that Directorate S maintained for precisely the situation that Barsky had created, the situation of an operative who had gone irrecoverably native and who represented an unacceptable ongoing information security risk. The contingency was the deployment of an elimination asset. In 1988, Albrecht Dittrich, Jack Barsky, electrician, husband, father, resident of New Jersey, was facing the credible prospect of lethal action from the organization that had created him. The confirmation that the threat was real and operational came not through the numbers station, but through a direct, physical contact, the most operationally aggressive step that Moscow Center could take against an asset in the field. Without escalating to actual elimination. On a commuter platform in New Jersey, as Barsky waited for his train home, a man stepped deliberately into his immediate personal space. The man did not look at him. As the noise of the approaching train swelled to cover their voices, the man spoke quietly, in fluent German. A language that no one else in the crowd understood. A language that, as the noise of the approaching train swelled to cover their voices, the man spoke quietly, in fluent German. A language that no one else in the crowd understood. A language that was, in that New Jersey commuter context, a message in itself. He told Barsky that he needed to come home, that the consequences of continued non-compliance were not bureaucratic. And then the train arrived, and the man stepped aboard and was gone into the crowd. The operational implication was unmistakable. If Moscow Center could place a messenger within whispered distance of Barsky on a routine commute, meaning they knew his schedule, his routes, and his physical location with operational precision, they could, with equivalent effort, place an elimination operative at the same proximity. Barsky now understood, with complete clarity, the full geometry of his situation. He could not simply continue his domestic routine and hope the problem would resolve itself. Moscow knew where he was. Moscow knew his schedule. Moscow had demonstrated the capability to reach him in the most mundane moments of his daily life. The organization that had created him, trained him, and deployed him across 7 years of institutional investment was actively considering the permanent solution to the problem he had become. And he could not turn to the FBI for protection, because doing so would require him to disclose a decade of active espionage against the United States, a disclosure that would destroy his American life, his family, and his freedom in a single conversation. He was caught in the no-man's land between two superpowers, both of which had reasons to want him managed, and neither of which was offering him a viable path forward. The solution that Barsky developed was, in retrospect, one of the most operationally sophisticated personal deception operations of the Cold War era. Not because it required elaborate technical preparation or institutional resources, but because it required only a precise and ruthless analysis of the specific institutional psychology of the men he was trying to deceive. He needed to construct a narrative that Moscow Center would find more plausible than the actual truth, and more operationally convenient to accept than the alternative of escalating to elimination. In the late 1980s, a biological crisis was consuming the American public health landscape in a manner that had no precedent in modern American medical history. The AIDS epidemic had by 1988 killed tens of thousands of Americans and had fundamentally altered the social and medical architecture of American civilian life. Behind the Iron Curtain, it was something entirely different. Soviet state media framed the epidemic as evidence of Western moral decay. The Soviet healthcare system was wholly unprepared to manage it. And the Soviet intelligence apparatus viewed it with a combination of institutional dread and profound cultural stigma that rendered it, from Barsky's analytical perspective, a weapon of extraordinary potential. Barsky encoded a final transmission to Moscow Center. He informed the First Chief Directorate that he had contracted the virus. He was not asking for delay. He was not requesting renegotiation of the recall terms. He was presenting Moscow Center with a biological and logistical reality that, correctly framed, would cost them less operationally to accept than to refute. He was, he told them, dying. The American medical system was offering experimental treatment protocols that were entirely unavailable in the Soviet Union. If he returned home, he would be denied access to those treatments and would die faster. And he would bring a highly contagious, profoundly stigmatized pathogen directly into the secure facilities of the intelligence apparatus. He would be a biological hazard to his handlers, to the debriefing staff, to the operational security of the Directorate itself. The deception worked, not because it was flawless. A properly resourced counterintelligence review could have exposed it. It worked because it exploited, with surgical precision, the exact combination of institutional fears and cultural biases that governed the First Chief Directorate's response to the specific variable Barsky had introduced. The aging commanders in Moscow found the story plausible. It confirmed their pre-existing model of American society as a site of moral and biological danger. It weaponized their self-preservation instincts. The handlers who would have been responsible for Barsky's repatriation did not want to physically interact with an operative carrying a pathogen whose transmission characteristics they did not fully understand. And it presented them with a problem that the Soviet bureaucratic machinery, confronted with a variable it had no established protocol for managing, did what bureaucratic machineries always do when overwhelmed by the unfamiliar. It filed the problem away. The recall protocol was suspended. The emergency exfiltration windows were closed. The file remained nominally open but operationally inactive. And Barsky dismantled his communications equipment, destroyed his one-time pads, severed the invisible tether that had connected him to Moscow Center for a decade, and returned to his life. In December 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The state that had recruited Albrecht Dittrich, trained him, funded his deployment, and hunted him. When he refused to return, ceased to exist. The First Chief Directorate was restructured into the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation. The files relating to the illegals program were transferred, with varying degrees of completeness and archival integrity, into the successor organization's classification system. The operational file on Jack Barsky, nominally still open, its subject last reported as terminally ill in the United States, was one of thousands of Cold War operational records being processed by a new institutional apparatus with different priorities, different resources, and a fundamentally different geopolitical context. Barsky advanced in his career. He had, in the early 1990s, parlayed his electrical trade credentials into a position in the information technology sector, a transition that reflected the genuine intelligence and technical capability that Directorate S had identified. In him, 2 decades earlier, now deployed entirely in the service of his American life rather than his Soviet mission. He had a mortgage. He had a professional reputation. He had a life that had, over 15 years of continuous inhabitation, become genuinely and irreversibly his. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had no idea he existed. While Barsky was living his unremarkable life in the American Northeast, something was happening on the other side of the world that would eventually unravel the invisibility he had so carefully maintained. In the newly independent Baltic state of Latvia, a man walked into the British embassy in Riga and offered what he had been carrying, concealed in a rural dacha outside Moscow for more than a decade. His name was Vasily Mitrokhin. He was a retired KGB archivist who had spent his career in the deepest classified bowels of the First Chief Directorate, the rooms where the operational files of decades of Soviet intelligence activity were maintained, and for 12 years, working with a patience and a methodical discipline that matched anything in the operational files he was transcribing. He had been stealing it, because Mitrokhin could not risk smuggling original documents past the KGB's security checkpoints. He took handwritten notes on scraps of paper concealed in his shoes, his socks, the lining of his clothing. He carried these notes home, typed them into full manuscripts, and stored the manuscripts in metal containers buried under the floor of his dacha outside Moscow. Over 12 years, he accumulated what became known as the Mitrokhin Archive, one of the most comprehensive and historically significant intelligence windfalls in the history of Western counterintelligence. When British intelligence exfiltrated Mitrokhin and his buried archive from the former Soviet Union in 1992, the analytical processing challenge it presented was enormous. The archive was not a database. It was a fragmented, cross-referencing puzzle of operational codenames, biographical fragments, dead-drop locations, and partial mission histories. Accumulated across 4 decades of the KGB's global intelligence activities, the Mitrokhin Archive was transferred to the Counterintelligence Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. American analysts began working through the translated material, systematically cross-referencing it against known cases, flagging anomalies, and identifying references to operations and operatives that had previously been entirely unknown to the American intelligence community. Among the fragments that the FBI's analysts identified in the Mitrokhin material was a poor reference to a Directorate S illegal deployed to the United States in the late 1970s, using the stolen identity of a deceased American child born in Maryland in May 1944. The operational logic of the investigation that followed was elegant in its simplicity. The FBI did not need to search New York or New Jersey for a hidden Russian spy. They needed to search the public record for a dead child who was somehow still alive. Analysts cross-referenced historical mortality records in Maryland, specifically deaths of children in the appropriate date range, against active federal records, Social Security accounts, tax filings, motor vehicle registrations, credit files. They were looking for a statistical impossibility. A person whose birth record was paired with a death record in the county archives of Maryland, but who was simultaneously active in the contemporary administrative systems of the United States. The process was methodical, resource-intensive, and took time. But the algorithmic logic was sound, and eventually the contradiction in the public record surfaced. A man named Jack Barsky, born in Maryland in 1944, was living a normal life in the American Northeast, paying income tax, maintaining a driver's license, carrying an active credit profile. According to a cemetery in Maryland, he had been in the ground since 1955. In May 1997, the FBI executed the final move in the operation with a studied, deliberate precision that reflected the Counterintelligence Division's complete awareness of who they were dealing with. A trained Directorate S illegal, even a retired one, was not a standard criminal arrest target. His training included surveillance detection, counter-surveillance, evasion techniques, and the psychological conditioning to remain composed under institutional pressure. A heavily armed tactical arrest in a public location risked triggering the defensive protocols that had been drilled into him decades ago in Moscow. Instead, the FBI used a controlled traffic interception at a toll plaza on a Pennsylvania interstate. Vehicles ahead and behind, carefully positioned to prevent evasion. A plainclothes agent approaching the driver's window with federal credentials before Barsky had any opportunity to make a decision about his response. The agent did not address him as Jack Barsky. He addressed him as Albrecht. The agent outlined what the FBI knew: the deployment from East Germany, the training in Moscow, the Social Security application, the decade of intelligence activity, the communications architecture, the recall signal and the refusal, the medical deception, all of it. He then presented the options. Silence or flight would result in arrest, prosecution for espionage, and the destruction of the life Barsky had built. Full cooperation would result in a different path. Quiet debriefing, no public prosecution, protection of his family from the immediate consequences of what was about to become known. The counterintelligence analysts had anticipated denial, resistance, or stoic silence. What they received instead was, by every account of the debriefing officers who were present, something that none of their training or their operational experience had specifically prepared them for. Relief. The crushing psychological burden of maintaining two entirely separate lives, of lying to his wife, of constantly monitoring his periphery for Soviet assassins or American federal agents, was finally over. He accepted the offer. He agreed to cooperate fully. The debriefings ran for several months. Barsky submitted to polygraph examinations, multiple rounds covering every aspect of his operational history, and passed them all. He was exactly what he said he was, a retired asset who wanted to be left alone, and was prepared to provide full historical cooperation in exchange for the opportunity to continue living the life he had chosen over the one he had been assigned. The intelligence product of those debriefings was, by the FBI's and CIA's assessment, historically significant. Barsky provided granular technical detail on Directorate S's psychological profiling methodology. He mapped the geographic locations of historical dead drops across multiple New York boroughs. He described the encrypted communications windows and the proxy routing systems in operational detail. He explained the microdot production process, the one-time pad destruction methodology, in the SDR protocols as they had been specifically trained and, deployed in the 1970s and 1980s. The historical value of this material lay not primarily in its operational currency. The Soviet Union no longer existed, and its intelligence infrastructure had been transformed by the events of 1991. But in its capacity to validate and contextualize the fragmentary Mitrokhin archive material. Every confirmed detail from Barsky's debriefing that could be cross-referenced against the Mitrokhin fragments provided the FBI's analysts with a calibration point for assessing the reliability of the archive's wider content. The debriefings did not simply close one case. They provided a methodological framework for assessing dozens of other cases that the Mitrokhin material had flagged but could not independently resolve. Following his extensive cooperation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation honored their agreement. Barsky was not subjected to a public trial. He was allowed to return to his suburban life, his corporate career, and his family. And in a bureaucratic procedure that perfectly encapsulates the paradox of his entire existence, the man who arrived in the United States carrying the stolen birth certificate of a deceased Maryland child eventually stood in a government building and was legally sworn in as an official citizen of the country he had once been sworn to. Undermine the deep cover network that had placed him there collapsed under the weight of its own ideological contradictions. The radio arrays in Cuba stopped transmitting his encrypted call signs. The handlers who hunted him retired into the obscurity of a post-Soviet intelligence community, reconstructing its entire institutional purpose. The monolithic bureaucracy that engineered his deployment dissolved into the archives of history. The ghost simply faded into the crowd, exactly as he was trained to do. The difference was that this time, there was no mission behind the disappearance. There was no handler waiting for a report. There was no shortwave frequency to tune to on Thursday evenings. There was no one-time pad in the desk drawer. There was just the house and the street, and the child growing up, and the life that had been built from a foundation of pure deception and had become, in the most ironic and most human conclusion possible, entirely real. The Jack Barsky case stands, in the historical literature of the Cold War illegals program, as perhaps the single most complete demonstration of the fundamental operational paradox at the heart of Directorate S's entire strategic doctrine. The program's theoretical foundation was the belief that ideological conditioning, applied with sufficient rigor and sustained over sufficient time, could create a human instrument capable of inhabiting a hostile society indefinitely without being changed by it. The program's operational requirement that the operative must genuinely inhabit that society in order to generate undetectable cover, guaranteed that this belief would be tested in the harshest possible conditions. And in the case of Albrecht Dittrich, the test produced an unambiguous result. The conditioning did not hold. The society won, not through the mechanism of counterintelligence, not through the mechanism of ideological confrontation, not through any of the adversarial processes that both sides of the Cold War had invested in so heavily. It won through the mundane, accumulated, irresistible force of ordinary life. The grocery store, the paycheck, the electrical conduit running through the structural framing of a Manhattan commercial building on a Tuesday morning, the child's drawing on the refrigerator, the cumulative weight of 15 years of lived American reality against 7 years of Moscow. Constructed theoretical preparation. The Soviet Union spent decades and vast institutional resources building a weapon. What they built instead in the end was a man. His name was Jack Barsky. He never existed, and he never stopped existing. There is a specific quality to the institutional arrogance that produced the illegals program, and it is worth examining in precise analytical terms, because it is the same quality that ultimately destroyed the program from the inside. Directorate S was staffed, at its senior levels, by men who had spent their entire professional lives inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus. They were, by any measure, sophisticated analysts of human behavior and geopolitical dynamics. They were not naive. They were not ideologically blinded in the crude sense that Western propaganda suggested. They were cold, rational, institutionally experienced professionals who had constructed an elaborate and expensive operational program on the basis of a specific analytical assumption, and who had invested sufficiently in that assumption that they could not easily revise it when the evidence began to contradict it. The assumption was that American society, as they had modeled it through the lens of Marxist-Leninist analytical doctrine, was structurally fragile, economically exploitative, politically unstable, socially atomized, approaching a systemic crisis that would make its civilian population increasingly receptive to ideological alternatives. An operative embedded in that society would observe its dysfunction from the inside, and that observation would reinforce rather than erode his ideological commitment to the Soviet alternative. The deep cover deployment was supposed to be a self-reinforcing experience. The harder the American reality was, the stronger the operative's conviction would become that the Soviet system represented a superior historical trajectory. This is what Moscow Center believed. This is what the curriculum at the school had been designed to prepare its trainees to experience. And this is what, in contact with the actual observable reality of 1980s American working-class life, proved to be entirely, irreversibly wrong. The irony is structural, not accidental. Directorate S built the program that destroyed its own theoretical foundation. By deploying the best-prepared, most carefully selected, most thoroughly trained operatives it could produce into the deepest possible contact with American civilian society, it subjected its own analytical model to the most rigorous empirical test imaginable. And the test returned a result that the program's designers had not anticipated and could not accommodate. American society was not what Moscow Center's model said it was, and the men and women who were positioned to make that observation directly, the ones with eyes and ears inside the supermarket aisles and the construction sites and the school pickup queues, were the very ones whose operational function depended on their not drawing the obvious conclusion. Barsky was not the only illegal to experience this. The partially declassified record of the Mitrokhin archive and the subsequent FBI and CIA investigations, it enabled identified several other Directorate S deployments in which operatives showed signs, in their intelligence product and their communications patterns, of the same slow ideological erosion that had manifested in Barsky's case. Not all of them refused recall orders. Not all of them survived their deployments. Not all of their cases have been publicly resolved. But the pattern is visible in the aggregate data, and it points toward a systemic, vulnerability in the program's architecture, that the senior leadership of Directorate S never publicly acknowledged and perhaps never fully understood the operational lesson that the Barsky case offers to the historical analyst is not about tradecraft. Barsky's tradecraft was excellent. His cover was maintained for a decade without generating a single counterintelligence tripwire. The FBI found him through an archival process that had nothing to do with any operational error on his part. It found him through the posthumous intelligence product of a disillusioned archivist who had spent 12 years hand-copying files in his shoes. If Mitrokhin had not defected, if the Mitrokhin archive had not existed, Jack Barsky would in all probability have lived out his life in the American Northeast with his family and his career and his social security number and his mortgage, and no one outside a small and dwindling group of former Soviet intelligence officers would ever have known who he was. The tradecraft worked. The operational security held. What failed was the ideological premise that the program was built on. And ideological premises, unlike tradecraft protocols, cannot be revised by a classified internal directive or corrected by a more intensive training curriculum. The Mitrokhin archive changed the historical record in ways that extend far beyond the Jack Barsky case. It validated, for the first time with documentary precision, the scale and operational sophistication of the Soviet illegals program during the Cold War era. Before Mitrokhin, Western counterintelligence agencies had suspected the program's existence and had identified individual cases, but they had no comprehensive picture of its scope, its operational methodology, or the total number of assets deployed across Western target countries. The Mitrokhin material provided that picture, fragmentarily and incompletely, but with sufficient granularity to establish beyond reasonable analytical doubt that the illegals program was larger, and more systematically organized, and more operationally sophisticated than the Western intelligence community had previously assessed. The debriefing of Jack Barsky provided a complementary source of operational intelligence that the Mitrokhin archive alone could not supply. The subjective, experiential account of what the program felt like from the inside. Mitrokhin's archive was institutional: files, directives, operational records, the paper infrastructure of a bureaucratic intelligence apparatus. Barsky's account was human, the experience of living the program's requirements in real time over a decade, in the specific social and psychological conditions that the program's designers had created, and that its operatives had to actually inhabit. The combination of the two sources produced something that neither could have generated alone: a complete picture of the illegals program from both its institutional architecture and its human interior, the resolution of Barsky's legal situation, the agreement that substituted cooperation for prosecution and allowed him to remain in the country and the life he had built, was not universally endorsed within the FBI's counterintelligence community. There were officers who believed that an operative who had spent a decade conducting active espionage against the United States should face prosecution regardless of his subsequent cooperation, and that the agreement represented an institutional accommodation that set a problematic precedent. There were others who held that the intelligence value of Barsky's full cooperation, freely given over an extended period, was worth more to the national security interest than a prosecution that would have produced a shorter and more adversarial engagement. The internal debate was never resolved in any formal sense. The decision was made at a level above the counterintelligence division's operational staff, on the basis of considerations that the available declassified record does not fully illuminate. What the record shows is the outcome. Barsky cooperated. The FBI honored the agreement, and Albrecht Dittrich, who had been Jack Barsky for 19 years, became Jack Barsky in the only sense that finally mattered: legally, officially, irreversibly, with a United States citizenship certificate bearing the name on the Social Security card that a federal government clerk in 1978 had issued without suspicion to a man sitting in a government office with a dead child's birth certificate and 7 years of Moscow-designed preparation for exactly that moment. The Soviet Union, invested in the illegals program as a long-term strategic asset, a capability that would, over decades, develop human intelligence infrastructure inside Western societies that could be activated when geopolitical circumstances required it. The return on that investment, measured against its cost in resources and time and the human lives shaped and consumed by it, was in the assessment of most historians and intelligence analysts who have examined the available record, remarkably low. The intelligence that the illegals produced was primarily observational and analytical rather than technical or operational. It informed Moscow Center's understanding of Western society without providing the kind of actionable intelligence that could materially alter the strategic balance. It was expensive, sophisticated, and ultimately decorative, a monument to the operational ingenuity of Directorate S and the human capacity for sustained performance under impossible conditions, built on an ideological foundation that the program's own deployment mechanism was structurally guaranteed to erode. Albrecht Dittrich lives in the United States. He has written about his experience. He has spoken publicly about it. The ghost, in the end, chose not to remain a ghost. That choice, the choice of visibility over invisibility, of acknowledged identity over maintained cover, is perhaps the most complete possible refutation of the program's foundational premise. Directorate S had built a man designed to disappear. The man it built decided in the end that he would rather be found.